This video will show you how much Saint John Bosco valued the virtue of obedience through two stories. The first has to do with one of his oratory boys who threw a cabbage at a priest's head, and the second is how he rebuked a rebellious order of nuns who wouldn't obey their bishop. The Miracles and Prophecies of Saint John Bosco, a project of America Needs Fatima. I'm your host, Matthew Miller. Subscribe for new episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. As the number of oratory boys grew into the hundreds, the bland discipline of the past had to evolve into something more formal and regimented through gradual changes, of course, always done with love for their souls. Some of his evening talks in 1865 show his efforts to make them more disciplined. He once said, "Last night I suggested that you make a little sacrifice for Our Lady's sake by observing order and silence in the dining room. I was hoping that you would cooperate, but to my surprise I have learned that today you are more unruly than ever. I cannot tolerate such behavior because discipline in the house is everything. You walk into the dining room shouting and shoving. You keep laughing and talking in time of silence, and you rush out in the same disorderly manner. The assistants are completely ignored as though they weren't there at all. Most of you behave, but there are about 50 who cause all the trouble just for the fun of it. I have therefore decided that from tomorrow on, you will enter the dining room in an orderly fashion. Father Savio will line you up in the porticos and send you in by groups. You will likewise leave one table at a time. I don't want punishments in the house, but I want the assistants to report everything to me. I intend to bind them in conscience to do so. Whoever is at fault in any way will be sent home at once because I cannot tolerate indiscipline in the house. I put up with a lot of things, but when discipline is at stake, I am inflexible. If it were only a question of a breach of manners between you and me, I would overlook it, but when disrespect is publicly shown to the other superiors, I can't ignore it." This warning was quite effective, which was to be expected because the boys loved Don Bosco and didn't want to displease him. As a former pupil once said, he was so easy to approach that we were drawn to him as to a magnet. It was really startling to see visitors crowd around him in order to kiss his hand and kneel for his blessing. On such occasions, we felt a great loss in being unable to approach him. I can state that Don Bosco's boys generally went along with his efforts on their behalf. They behaved well, and even admirably. If occasionally some pupil couldn't adjust to the spirit of the house, he usually left of his own accord. Expulsions were extremely rare. However, an incident took place during these days which involved a general disrespect for authority, the first and only time in the history of the oratory. Father Angelo Savio wasn't popular with certain students because of his rigorous stand on discipline. One day, while he was supervising more than 300 boys in the main dining room, a piece of bread hit him in the back. Perhaps the shot was not directed at him. Prudently, Father Savio ignored it, but when the next day the same thing happened, he mentioned it to Don Bosco. Evidently, this was no accident. At the good night talk, Don Bosco spoke gravely to the boys about it, stating that anyone guilty again of such an offense would be immediately expelled. The following day, as the boys were lined up in the porticos waiting to go into the dining room by groups under Father Savio's supervision, a stalk of cabbage struck his beretta. Quickly turning round, he caught a young lad named Augustine in the act of lowering his arm. Immediately, he sent him to an adjacent small room and led the others into the dining hall. The lad, flustered and crying, kept saying that he had aimed at a companion, not the superior. He was a very lively boy, thoughtless at times, but well-behaved and a good student. Because of this, his teacher, who thought highly of him, and other teachers and assistants who were convinced of his innocence, sided with him at once. Unmindful of their own affront to one of their superiors, they let the boy out of that room and, sympathizing with him, let him eat dinner with them. Much to the general surprise, they kept him with them the rest of the day. Emotion was clouding their judgment. At supper time, the teachers, who for other reasons bore some grudge to Father Savio, began to criticize him severely for having summarily punished an innocent pupil. Tempers were running high, and words were not too carefully weighed. Then and there, Don Bosco kept silent, but at the good night talk, he announced that Augustine would be sent home the next morning. It came like a thunderbolt. After the boys retired to the dormitories, there remained in the playground only a few bewildered teachers, including those who had declared themselves against Father Savio and condemned his severe measure. After much grumbling, one of them, a Salesian craftmaster, declared, "Let one of us go to Don Bosco and tell him clearly that if that boy is not reprieved, we'll all leave." "Let's not push things that far," objected another. "I will talk with Don Bosco." It was 10:30 p.m. and Don Bosco was still at his desk. The prefect of studies told him of the deep dissatisfaction of certain confreres and pleaded for an immediate pardon. "There is no doubt about what the boy did," Don Bosco countered. "God alone can judge his intentions, but his action at a time when silence was mandatory was in itself a breach of discipline. Furthermore, such an action in the wake of repeated warnings to the contrary could have triggered other serious infractions. Yet, despite the gravity of the offense, I could have found a way to spare the boy, who's really good. But you people, by openly siding with him, have made it impossible for me to back down. Everybody knows that you've set yourselves against Father Savio, and I shall never permit authority to be so challenged." All pensively withdrew to their rooms. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed. Some whispered, "Leave Don Bosco? Never." "With Don Bosco till death," another said, voicing everybody's sentiments. And so it was. At dawn, Augustine left the oratory. A few weeks later, when things had quieted down and the matter was no longer an issue, Augustine wrote to Don Bosco, asking pardon for his thoughtless and involuntary act. When Don Bosco asked, Father Savio begged him to let the boy return and finish his schooling. Don Bosco relented and said that he could. This incident taught everybody a lesson. They saw that when respect for authority was at stake, Don Bosco had no regard for wrongdoers, not even when one of the best pupils fell into disobedience, backed by some of the most influential members of the staff. That's how highly he valued the virtue of obedience. There was another time when Don Bosco traveled to a convent that was in open rebellion against the local bishop, and seemingly couldn't be persuaded to obey. They wanted to follow the strict rule of their order and thus become independent of their ordinary. On hearing of Don Bosco's arrival, they invited him to visit them. He was ushered into the reception room with signs of honor and esteem. All the nuns were on their knees. They likewise knelt on coming to the grill to speak to him. When the Mother Superior asked him to address the community, he tried to decline, but she insisted. "All right then," he said. "Tell me, do you think much of Don Bosco?" "Of course we do," they said. "We look upon you as a saint." "Will you accept then what I'm going to tell you?" "Most willingly." "Good. You know that Holy Scripture says, 'Obey your superiors.' Therefore, these are matters for confession," the Mother Superior broke in, "and are the exclusive concern of our spiritual director." "You say that you esteem me as a saint, and then you refuse to listen to me?" Don Bosco countered. "Excuse me, Father, but you'd better keep out of this." "Very well, but I hope—" He couldn't continue. The curtains had been drawn over the grill. On returning the next day, he was again received most respectfully, so he decided to make another attempt. "I'd like to speak to you as a father," he said. "As a friend." "Would you like a cup of coffee, Father?" they interrupted. "No thanks, but just think, your break with the bishop—" "How about a glass of lemonade, Father?" "Please listen. You must think of the consequences." "Leave that to us, Father. This is no concern of yours. We'll look after our own consciences." Don Bosco's charitable intervention proved totally ineffective. The controversy ended with the bishop's suppression of the convent. Two of these rebels later called on Don Bosco, but still stubbornly clung to their notions. When such groundless stubbornness takes hold of one's mind, Don Bosco warned his Salesians, how can sanctity ever flourish? Where humble obedience reigns, grace will triumph. To hear St. John Bosco's vision of the Angel of China, just click on the video above. Thank you for watching, God bless you, and Our Lady keep you.